Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Tortoise ThinkIn on this beautiful sunny evening, but on a subject that is far from sunny, unemployment. Unemployment, mass unemployment, specifically youth unemployment, and how the UK is going to get hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people back to work. We're really grateful that the Shadow Chancellor, Anneliese Dodds, is here this evening. Anneliese, thank you so much for making the time. It's a couple of weeks since Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, your opposite number, stood up and gave what was called a summer statement. And so having the chance to, if you like, go through the small print of that with you and try to think through what Labour's proposals would be to address the economic crisis we're facing is really helpful for us. Tortoise, as you know, is a slow newsroom. We're not trying to add to the breaking news, but try to understand what's driving the news. And it feels as though what we're seeing in the economy is much like what we saw in the early phases of the coronavirus pandemic itself in the spring, something that you feel is gathering in force and impact in a way that's probably bigger and more difficult than we've had the experience to comprehend. So we're enormously grateful to you, Anneliese, to be with us today. We're also joined by Kathleen Henahan. If you are, as I am, one of a very small group, possibly even a fan group of one of the Resolution Foundation, Kathleen, thank you for joining us. It's pathetic, I know, but I am a colossal follower of your work and the work of your colleagues at Resolution because it feels as though it's economic analysis put to a specific use, put to thinking about the impacts on low and middle income families. And clearly that's a specific area of interest right now in this subject. And then we're delighted too that the co-founder of, the founder of White Hat, Ewan Blair, is here. Just to give you a sense, I joined the call in a sort of state of despair, and Ewan promised that actually he'd begin to offer us some constructive ways of thinking how we dealt with this problem. So Ewan, the way this conversation is going to work is that the despair and the worry is going to mount, and then you're going to sort of, I hope, come in with a set of thoughts of how things can be done differently, not to heap too much expectation on your shoulders. But just for those of you who are new, and I suppose all three of you are new to our thinkings, the idea of them was to operate like an open news meeting. So as if you're going into a newsroom where everyone wants to essentially, put their thoughts, give their points of view, and we want to hear from as many people as possible in the course of the hour. So please do weigh in. Let me know what you think. Do just weigh in. You can do so in the chat, so say what you think. My colleague Basha Cummings is here and is marshalling the chat. Good luck as we get into the finer points of unemployment's knock-on impacts in the economy. But do weigh in, and as you know, you also can just raise your hand by hitting the participants tab. But can I start, Anneliese, by just trying to get a grip on the scale of what we're talking about here? And the reason that I sort of joined in, if you like, a kind of unusually dark mood is if you look at the indicators of where this is going, right? So not the, the number of people claiming work-related benefits today, 2.6 million. If you look at the impact on hours worked recently, what you can see is nearly a 17% decline overall in hours worked. I think that's what the ONS says. That gives you a sense of what's actually going on in the workforce. And when you start calculating the coming costs of bringing people back into work off furlough, nearly 9 million people in the furloughing scheme, you can see that as we get through August and into September, certainly come October, the calculus for companies is really difficult. Nearly 35% of employee costs then resides with companies. And we must begin to see numbers going way, way higher and towards, I think, what the OECD has pointed to, somewhere between 11 to 14% unemployment, up from 3.9%. And I just wanted to get a sense from you because, the Chancellor and, if you like, the Downing Street has been quite wary of giving us a sense of the scale of unemployment that's coming by the second half of the year. And I wondered, as Shadow Chancellor, what you think the scale of the problem that we're looking at is.
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I think it's such an exciting format and it's great to be joined by other people with so much experience in this area. I mean, I think it is difficult. We've got to be honest, estimating exactly what the shape of developments are going to be when it comes to unemployment. Actually, some of the data seem to point sometimes in slightly different directions. I mean, actually, the claimant count was at 2.9 mil, then went down to 2.6, as you said. One thing that does concern me, and where we've got quite robust data, is the information that comes from HMRC, which looks at how many people are actually on the payroll, and it suggests that there's been really quite a large number of jobs, going out of the labour market, about 650,000. Of course, some of the reductions in hours could have been related to what was going on with the furlough scheme, and people may hopefully be getting some of those hours back, but actually seeing that reduction in jobs coming through, I think is very worrying. I anticipate, unless we see changes to the support packages, and I think that there does need to be change in how they're withdrawn. Unless we see those changes, then we'll see a kind of steady reduction in employment at various different points. And we've obviously kind of plotted this out. So we know that, for example, for larger employers, they need to start their redundancy consultation 45 days before when they'd have to make any staff redundant. And sadly, we saw a number of quite significant redundancies being announced about that time before the first changes coming in for the furlough scheme, and then that affecting smaller employers. They have a shorter redundancy period. I think sadly we'll see that kind of stepped process feeding through up to October, as I said, unless changes are made to the way in which those packages are being withdrawn. So I think this is a worrying time. It does look like we're likely to be getting back to certainly kind of 1980s era unemployment levels, unfortunately. Some different characteristics, so not necessarily, or at least not the same pattern of regional concentration as back then, but certainly, very worrying levels feeding through.
I mean, I was looking at this, Annalise, because I was trying to get a sense of the experience that in my lifetime of meaningful unemployment, financial crisis, huge knock to the economy, I think 6% shrink in GDP, but actually not such a massive decline overall in employment. I think a knock of just over 2% in overall employment. The 1990s recession, when I first joined the labour market, actually was the reverse. The knock to the economy wasn't as high, but it had an outsized impact. But just to give a sense of it, because a lot of people joining this evening will sort of have, if you like, it's probably the nostalgic is the wrong word, but a kind of historic view of 80s, unemployment. Even then, we were talking, I think, about just 6%. So the scale we're talking about is really huge. And I just wondered whether I've noticed the way you've talked about unemployment as regards the government's approach, and talked in particular about three groups. We're going to focus mostly on youth unemployment tonight, but you talked about younger people, older people, and disabled people. And so will you just talk a little bit about those groups obviously have very different sets of needs in terms of government supports or intervention. How do you approach it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I suppose I would also tack on actually to those three groups the situation for women who have unmet childcare needs, which I think is going to become even a bigger group. I mean, clearly it's been particularly problematic with schools being closed, but many issues with childcare providers currently, which look likely to lead to greater problems for women re-entering the labour market. And of course, a lot of the rise that we saw in employment previously was coming from women being drawn into the labour market, and it looks like that might start to go backwards. I mean, with young people, I think there are many specific challenges. Of course, a lot of the time they're moving into the economy precisely through those businesses, which right now are impacted by social distancing and a lack of demand. So it's very difficult for them to build up the kind of expertise and experience that is necessary. New active labour market measures coming in, which we welcome, we called for, but I'm sure we'll go on to talk about whether they're going to be able to deliver for young people and not substitute young workers, subsidise young workers for other groups. And then older people, again, I think a different set of challenges there. I think it's very, very difficult. If you imagine putting yourself in the shoes of somebody who's maybe in their 50s, they might have had a similar job for a very long period of time, and that job is just simply not available anymore, or very, very challenging. I mean, think about people, for example, who've been working in offices and some of the support functions where, given the changing character of work, it's just not going to be there, or people working in hotel industry, etc., with lower demand, them kind of hitting up against particularly some of the conditionality in the social security regime, to me does seem to be pretty problematic now that we've got sanctioning and whatnot switched back on again. I think they do need to look again at this and how there can be tailored support for older people. Then people with disabilities, we know that generally often, I mean, obviously depending on the nature of the disability, but often people in those circumstances will be further away from the labour market, and therefore, unfortunately, when there's that kind of tide of additional people coming into unemployment, it pushes those who were further away kind of even further back, and therefore, again, there's a need, I think, for tailored programmes to make sure that people are supported into work and that they get that help. And all of this is clearly very, very challenging at a time, particularly when we have seen an increase in support going into the Department of Work and Pensions and job centres, but it's actually not back up to the level that it was back in kind of 2010, 2012. So it's still kind of less staff than back then. So I think it is going to be very difficult to provide that appropriate support.
So I would like to talk a little bit about the knock-on impacts of this and then the solutions, but I just wanted, there's so many people, even as you're speaking, Annalise, who are talking about it personally. I wondered if I can, to try and bring in some of them as we're speaking. I see that Ellie House has talked about the impacts on what it's like to be a graduate in the market now, and Georgie Laming is making this the point that you kicked off with, which is about the gendered impact of unemployment. I don't know whether or not, Georgie, you've got your camera on, you can weigh in now. There you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with Annalise that childcare is specifically an issue for young women, and it will mean that kind of returning or even trying to enter the job market in the first place is going to be really, really tough for them. And this kind of rush back to working in offices feels particularly difficult for young women. But I also think that young women are kind of disproportionately affected because of the industries they work in. So they're working in retail, they're working in travel, they're working in the beauty industries that might not be around for much longer. And they're often, the lowest paid staff in a company, the easiest to let go as well. I work every day with young women who, before the crisis, were applying for hundreds of entry-level jobs and not getting replies. Mm-hmm. So my big concern, and where I'd like to, tonight find some optimism, is how these schemes like Kickstart or whatever can actually address the kind of pre-crisis problems for young women, because they massively already existed. And I think we're kind of denying there wasn't already a crisis for young women when it comes to the labour market.
Georgie, thank you. I'm going to just invite Ellie House to weigh in. Ellie, are you there? You made a point in the chat. Hello there.
Hi. Yeah. No, I'm a recent graduate, and I was applying for entry-level jobs, as are most of my friends, and they were all cancelled. Pretty much all of them were cancelled. And so I'm going on to further study because I'm, in a lucky enough position to do so. And the friends that I have are in a similar position. Like, everyone I know is doing further study. And I think that's just going to create next year a knock-on effect where the new grads are going to come out and they're going to be competing with us, who have all been more educated, not really by choice. And then it's also going to create an inequality issue, bolster the ongoing inequality issue, whereby, people that can afford further study are going to be in a better position next year. So I just think it's a bigger problem than just what's happening right now.
Annalise, I'm going to put those 2 points to you in a second, but I'd just like to bring in Kathleen first, because Kathleen Henahan, you've studied the subject in some depth. Can you just give us a little bit more sort of texture on how youth unemployment tilts, or how mass unemployment tilts by gender, by age, and then what these longer term scarring impacts are likely to be?
Yeah, sure. So it's no surprise that anytime we see a recession, youth unemployment tends to skyrocket. And that's essentially understandable. It's sort of a last in, first out type scenario. But I think what's particularly worrying is the long-term consequences of that. So some of the research that we did found that even as many as 3 years after having left education in the midst of a crisis, the odds of a young person with lower level qualifications being in work are about half as what they otherwise would have been had the economy been ticking along. But it affects graduates as well. It affects all young people who leave in the midst of a crisis. It just affects people with lower level qualifications a bit worse. And I think for the reasons that we just sort of spoke of, graduates are a little bit more likely to be able to stay on in education and avoid those sort of gaps on their resume. And, there's the sectoral nature of this crisis, which just makes things even worse. We know that young people tend to get their start in exactly the same sectors that have been shut down and that are going to be struggling. And one, quite depressing figure, but we realized that about half of young women with lower level qualifications get their proper start in work in exactly these same shutdown sectors. So I'm not offering much light at the end of the tunnel. But.
No, but Kathleen, I appreciate that. But actually, what we're beginning to see then is something that, as well as the scale of the unemployment problem we're facing, is a distribution of unemployment, which is even more acute than our previous recessions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Annalise, on that front, I want to get into some of the constructive solutions, but hold off for a sec, because I have this fantasy, and I'm sure you might have the fantasy too, that there's a team of people working in the Shadow Chancellor's office modelling scenarios. And one of the things that we kind of find ourselves trying to understand is, what are the knock-on effects of mass unemployment? So how does that impact mortgage payments or demands or, revenues to the exchequer? And so how are you beginning to think not just about the sort of third quarter response that you need to make, but a response that looks ahead into 2021 and beyond?
Yeah, I think we've got a lot of existing research in this area, which really underlines a lot of the points that Kathleen was making and that others have suggested as well. It's my understanding that 20 years down the line after someone's had a period of unemployment when they were a young person, in some cases they could still be experiencing about a fifth less income than some of their peers. It's less for others, and it does tend to be often those, as was mentioned, who have lower qualifications who have the worst impact. But we know that from previous times when there was, when there were substantial levels of youth unemployment. So there's that impact on individuals, potentially their lifelong earnings, and clearly that has a knock-on impact on the exchequer. There's then also, of course, the impact on places as well. And I think we do need to think through that. This is quite an unusual recession, clearly, because of its deeply sectoral nature, but it does mean that, particularly coastal towns, for example, where there was already relatively high levels of unemployment, at least in the UK context. You think about the situation that might be faced by, say, a young single parent with caring responsibilities trying to find work in that context. It's going to be much, much harder. So place-based impacts, also impacts on other things that might not seem necessarily closely connected, but obviously the overall productivity of our economy. Yeah. If people aren't in work, if they're not financially secure, then very often, they'll be kind of taking any job that they can find, essentially, so that they get out of social security. That's not necessarily going to be the right job for them. And actually, I'm not just saying this because Kathleen's on the call, but the Resolution Foundation already done a lot of quite interesting work about how young people in the UK, you'd think they'd be pretty job mobile and that they'd be kind of seeking new opportunities. Actually, that slowed even before this crisis. Kind of related to some of the points that Georgie was mentioning, there's already issues for young people in the labour market, and they're intensified when you've got higher levels of unemployment.
I'm going to bring in a couple of others. I see that Andy's talking about his read on the jobs market now, Yelena too. I'm going to come to them in a minute, but I just want to bring in Ewan Blair first. Ewan, will you just tell people about White Hat and who you're trying to serve and who you're working with, and then just what you've seen at the moment in terms of what's happening now for young people and opportunities in the labour market?
Sure. So just for those of you who don't know, at White Hat, we are on a mission to create a diverse group of future leaders. And we think we'll do that by building an outstanding alternative to university. So our thesis is basically university's broken as a one-size-fits-all model. It's actually become an inhibitor to social mobility. And there are lots of stats that bear this out. But for example, over half of those on corporate grad schemes were educated at a private school. Only 4% of those claiming free school meals make it to a Russell Group university. And we're seeing the kind of acuteness of this right now. Universities have spent so long teaching people in isolation from the labor market what they think they want to learn, instead of actually focusing on the skills they're going to need to be successful and start to build long-term careers. And that's leading to this massive dissonance between what employers need and what they're looking for and what graduates are coming out with. And actually, it's been going on for a long time. I mean, previously, before founding White Hat, I worked in welfare to work. And we met lots of people with degrees who couldn't find jobs because their degree was not actually a hook to an employer. And we focus on three main areas. The first is giving employers a way of making contextual hiring decisions. So factoring in things like someone's background, the average grade in the school they've come from, whether they're a care leaver, understanding lots of the different characteristics that are important to employers. So competencies, values, and desires, not just academics and work experience. We teach people through applied learning, so basically how to problem solve in the workplace, things like data analytics, project management skills, software engineering, stuff that typically employers need. And then we have this really active community. So there are meetups, socials, sports teams, societies for apprentices. So they don't feel like it's a second tier alternative to university and they're not being offered some of those opportunities. And we basically focus mainly on professional services and tech. So our clients are people like Google, Facebook, Clifford Chance, Morgan Stanley, Santander, lots of names you'll be familiar with. And James, just the reason before I said, I'm optimistic to an extent. Now, make no mistake about it, the labor market shock we're witnessing is unprecedented and will be incredibly damaging to a lot of people. What it has done though, is it's harnessed political will and actually will more generally to remake the system. Because we've been careening towards this kind of place at the moment where, as I said, there's a complete disconnect from routes from education into employment. There are barriers being put up for people where they shouldn't be. You know, how do we make sure the best jobs of the next decade don't just go to the same people the best jobs of the last decade went to? And people are now having these conversations, right? Universities are in the thick of a crisis of both capability and will. And people are saying, is it worth me spending the same amount of money for a largely remote, subpar experience? Actually, what other things can I look at instead? And policymakers are right there. You know, the government in the last week has formally dropped the commitment to 50% of all young people going to university, and they announced an apprenticeship guarantee, which doesn't amount to very much at the moment, but there is will there.
So, and I genuinely don't know the answer to this. What's the pattern of recessions? Because it seems to me as though we went into the pandemic, certainly in the early weeks, with this sense of, strangely, a kind of hiatus in lives, a pause where people thought this is going to be a moment where we're going to rethink elements of our economy. And now I think as the scale of the problem dawns on us, there's actually the kind of get back to urge work. It's quite reactive. And you have to wonder whether or not it's going to reward those with assets and educational attainment, and it's actually not going to be a recession that enables the social mobility you talk about.
I'm not entirely sure I agree with that. I think it's partly because some of the things that are happening are sort of long overdue. So employers have been across the board dropping degree requirements for lots of roles, and they've come out and publicly stated that. And at the same time, 85% of the jobs that exist in 2030 don't exist today, according to most predictions. You've seen over the last 3 months, somewhere between 2 and 5 years of immediate digital transformation. Employers know that they have a problem around skills and lack of skills in their organization. And actually young people, if they're being trained in the right way and given those skills, can fill that gap for them. So there is an opportunity for young people there that it can allow a different type of young person to actually succeed, one who's not just going the typical university route. So I think this pandemic has just accelerated a whole load of things that were already happening in the background, and they're now just being talked about in mainstream.
Okay, well that is genuinely encouraging. That is encouraging. I'm going to invite a few people in, and then Annalise, I'm going to come back to you just to pick up on a few of these points. Forgive me if it comes at you in lots of different ways, but I hope that we can pull it all together in one form or other by the end. Sam, I'd love to bring in Andy W. Andy, I don't know what the W stands for, but I see that you are talking about being relatively new into work. So what's your experience of this?
So I'm a student at the moment, and I'm sort of thinking about the double hit that a no-deal Brexit potentially and the government's handling of COVID would have on a brain drain in the country, like with the junior doctors going to Australia under austerity. And as a New Zealand citizen, that's quite relevant to me. Right. But also many of my university cohort are foreign students, and if Britain becomes really unattractive to those, that'll have a huge blow on universities and our ability to, be competitive in the world.
Andy, thank you. I mean, it's interesting. A number of people, we didn't talk about Brexit for months, and then suddenly it's back, and you can have a strong sense of it. Yelena, do you want to join us? So, Yelena Sofronievich, are you there? Yes. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
There.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on Andy's point really about the cancellation of opportunity, and I've made this point in the chat as well. I think, especially for recent grad, I can speak as a recent grad myself. There were, on a typical year, there's 15,000 grad jobs in the market, and this year they estimate there's going to be about 3,000. There's something like 100 of us applying for every single role that there is, and all of the jobs that I have thus yet to be successful for any of the jobs that I have applied for, I can admit. But interestingly, even the employment support that I have reached out and tried to obtain has advised me to apply for production schemes or grad schemes, internships that have all been cancelled that I have already applied for. So even to get into the entry-level job, the scheme that you need has been cancelled. So it's very difficult in this market at the moment. But I really think that Ellie makes a fantastic point about this exacerbating inequalities, because we can really interrogate who can afford to use this time productively. And by that, I mean people who are able to go on, continue further education, perhaps gain more qualifications, or take on unpaid freelance work. And I completely agree that this needs to fit into our structural rethinking of the economy. It fits into the questions we've been asking throughout the pandemic about who is able to work from home, and who has access to certain resources with respect to schools and schooling children of all ages. So I just think it's very important that we don't consider this as a sort of one-off year, and see how this will affect both recent graduates and people who are currently in education still.
Yelena, thank you. I can see there's a host of comments, but I want to come back to Annalise, if I might. And Annalise, hearing all of this, I suppose we get a really clear sense of, one, the scale of the worry, two, the very pointed, particular way in which unemployment is going to hit in this country, and then three, the anxiety that's causing. Imagine for a minute that you were on the other side of the chamber, if you like, actually, that you're issuing, I know you said you wouldn't have issued a summer statement, you would have had an early budget in July. What would have been the elements to it?
Well, I think the major difference would have been really an acknowledgement of, I think, a factor that does set the UK apart from many other countries in dealing with this crisis, and that's the fact that we aren't seeing yet, and it's kind of reflected a bit in the conversation that's just happened, we're not yet seeing the level of vacancies coming back into the UK jobs market that we're seeing in many other countries. So, for example, in France and Poland, as I understand it, I mean, I know the context for the disease and its containment is different in other countries as well, but they're already seeing vacancies picking up in those countries. That has not happened in the UK. It looks like we'll have quite a slow recovery in terms of vacancies coming through, potentially 12 or 18 months until we're getting back to the level that we had previously. And that means, I think, we need to have a different approach to preventing people becoming unemployed in the first place. So we do need to have active labour market programmes. There's this new Kickstarter programme that a couple of people referred to. I mean, we need to make sure that that really works, that it's genuinely new opportunities, as I said, that it's not just pushing other workers out to get subsidised younger people in. But we do also need to do more to keep people in employment first. And I think that does mean looking again at the economic programmes and not withdrawing them at the same pace right across the economy. I think we need to look at what other countries are doing here. They're continuing forms of salary support for particularly hard hit industries. And, you know, I appreciate it's difficult, and I've said to the Chancellor, I appreciate it's difficult deciding between sectors. And he's quoted that bit of my sentence back, but I always finish it by saying, just because it's difficult, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. You know, you do need to, I think, in these circumstances with a sectoral recession, accept that you will need to have some forms of continuing wage support. I think when you do that, you can hopefully reduce a bit the number of people who are coming into the pool of the unemployed in the first place, because you'd be enabling a continuing relationship with an employer. I think we need to, as part of this, look, as other countries have, into retraining and reskilling that can be delivered. You know, for example, in Germany, their salary support scheme incentivizes employers to provide training, etc., while people are working those shorter hours. But I do think we need to do that. That, to me, would have been the biggest difference.
Yes. So and Annelies, can I just try and just nail down exactly what you do? So that as things currently stand, the furlough, the JRS scheme, ends at the end of October. So question one, how much longer would you run it for?
Yeah. Well, I think we need to really calibrate the system for those very, very hard hit sectors against both the impact of the lockdown, but also the resumption of demand. Now, this isn't easy. You know, it involves risks in different directions. And of course, we don't want to end up with a long-term situation where there's a lot of support for salaries in sectors that may not, sadly, be particularly viable, you know, in that long term. But I think that's where then linking this into retraining is particularly important. And, you know, it means facing up to some really pretty difficult questions, and government developing a strategy and tying that into the future of these schemes. I mean, you think about something like aviation, for example. I mean, there are huge job losses going on. There's going to have to be change, but it needs to be change that's facilitated and that's planned, and it will need to involve some form of salary support until you can, you know, get to a better planned outcome.
So it's interesting. We had Mervyn King join us a few weeks ago having a conversation like this. I was quite surprised, actually. Mervyn King's point was, this is a government-sanctioned shutdown of the economy. You need to have job support until GDP growth gets back to something close to what it was before the lockdown. Right? So he was a really long runway for JRS. If I understand what you're saying, Annelies, you're saying, yes, you need to continue it beyond October, and you need to continue it sectorally in response to demand in those sectors rather than do it nationally. Is that the way you'd approach it?
Well, I think particularly the latter. I think just saying there would be a continuation across the board isn't sensible in a context where I think some employers potentially have used the scheme in ways that it wasn't designed. I mean, actually, we've seen it to facilitate redundancy, and in some cases, employers keeping people on the furlough, then sacking them, then re-employing them on worse terms and conditions. This kind of thing. I think there does need to be a very careful consideration of where that support is still needed, where it's not going to be exploited by by employers. But I think it is necessary. And that is because of that issue about the number of new vacancies. I mean, countries have taken different approaches to this. In the US, there's no salary backfill support at all, but they have significantly increased unemployment benefit. That's an economy where, well, they don't call it unemployment benefit, but support through that mechanism. That seems to be a society where there's relatively quick creation of additional jobs, where the labour market gets going again quite quickly. It doesn't look like that's going to happen this time, and I think that's partly because of what you said before, James, about the impacts of the previous global financial crisis, where the new jobs that came in, a lot of the time, they weren't ones that required employers to put a lot of investment in. Often workers were coming in on relatively low pay, for a long period of constrained living standards. Those jobs are not necessarily going to be coming back in large numbers for some time to come. So we do need that continuing support, I think.
Okay, I mean, that's really helpful. I want to talk a little bit about other forms of support, Future Jobs Fund, and I want to come back in a moment to you and to talk about how people can get involved specifically actually in White Hat, but there are a number of people who've commented along the way. I'd really like to hear from Russell Wellbeing, who's made some points, and Alicia London, if you're happy to join, that'd be really interesting. Alicia, are you there? I'm just waiting to see. Alicia, I'll come back to you in a second if I can. Russell Wellbeing.
Hello.
Hello there.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, certainly.
Fantastic. Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'd like to ask a question. So I feel a lot of the employment and the jobs debate is centered around a false dichotomy, this idea that we have to choose between unemployment and full-time employment with an employer, when there are several other options that are going to be better for parents or for disabled people. I myself have learning difficulties, and I think that finding ways to help people start their own businesses is something that our system needs to focus on a lot better in our schools and our education programs, in our communities. There are so many people who would love to be a part of something, but our job centre services just funnels people towards endless CVs, sending off the same CVs to companies that read thousands of them. All of these people probably have a skill they could be using, could be marketing, could be developing, and the fact that they're not doing it is a huge loss to all of us in society.
Russell, thank you. Before I ask Annalise to reply, I'm just going to invite Lisa G to join us in the conversation, just because she started a comment in the chat, if you may have seen, with this very helpful sentence. This experience, Lisa, I think is going to turn out to be really helpful. I worked in a job centre in the mid to late 1980s. People are coming to you as a sage in this particular
So, well, I have to say my experience of job centres is 30 years out of date. However, and also as someone who graduated during a recession, I graduated and went into a job that required 5 O-levels, as they were in those days. But I then went on from that to do a job specialising in supporting disabled people with long-term health, mental and physical health issues, and ex-offenders into work. And one of the schemes that proved particularly useful at that time was a thing called the community programme, which provided 6 months, sometimes up to a year, training positions for unemployed people in projects and organisations that were of use to the community. Was it exploitative? Sometimes. Was it useful? On the other hand, yes, also sometimes. And one of the things that I really liked about it is that it meant that public money went to public benefit rather than into private pockets. And I think that's really important and really key at a time when so many communities need so much support and infrastructure is in such a terrible state. And, you know, can I name success stories? Yes. I still today work for somebody who I met on the other side of the desk and who's been a great friend ever since, and who, you know, and whose first work was in one of those programs.
Lisa, thank you. Annalise, will you just talk us through, and actually Kathleen, I'm going to ask you to, if you like, you know, mark the scorecard of Rishi Sunak on the responses so far. But Kathleen, will you just talk us through Lisa's point about job support through job centres and how those work, you know, Russell's, you know, point about a different approach to recruitment, but also then just touch on for us, will you, I know you talked about going back to the Future Jobs Fund, you know, which was obviously introduced by the Labour government, I think 2009, and sort of how you think that would work.
Yeah. So where to start? I mean, in terms of support, I think one of the things that we've already pointed out is just in terms of job centre support staff, we're still far below where we need to be, despite, you know, welcome policies to increase the number of people working in job centres and increase the number of work coaches. I think sort of looking back to the Future Jobs Fund, I mean, so Rishi Sunak has essentially developed this Kickstart scheme, which is a bit like the Future Jobs Fund, which came out during the financial crisis. which was a scheme that offered temporary, so like 6-month paid jobs for young people who had been long-term unemployed. So the idea is that, you know, Kickstart will replicate this 6-month jobs paid for 18 to 24-year-olds, again, who are at risk of unemployment. Future Jobs Fund was broadly pretty successful in terms of ensuring that young people stayed on and work afterwards. There were some questions about whether or not it was like it was efficient enough in terms of starting up. It took quite a while to start up, but they did work quite hard to make sure that the jobs were additional. So all being well, if we could recreate that with this Kickstart scheme, that would be ideal. But I think it is worth kind of pointing out that this scheme is really targeted at young people who were already going to struggle in the labour market. Yeah. And that's really important, and it's overdue, and obviously it's a really good thing to welcome, but just given the scale of what we think will happen to youth unemployment, it's not enough.
And Kathleen, can I just make a point about that, which is, you know, we're talking about, if I've got the numbers right here, you know, the Resolution Foundation's number saying 1/3 of 18 to 24-year-olds have seen their jobs disappear or furloughed.
Yeah.
Even of the 2.6 million people claiming work-related benefits, you know, 1/5 of those, 500,000, are 18 to 24, if I got the numbers right.
Yeah.
And I went back and I looked at the Future Jobs Fund. Between 2009 and 2011, if I'm right, it created 105,000 jobs at a cost of £680 million.
Yeah.
So there's a real issue here, which is your point, I know, which is scale.
Yeah, I think so. You know, with the best will in the world, we think we could probably get it. You know, we think they could probably get it up to about 325,000 jobs. But obviously, like, that's not immediately. It's going to take about 7 months for it to get up and running. And actually, if you look at where it's budgeted, they're expecting a lot of those jobs to come in next year. And I think sometimes that 300,000 odd jobs gets compared against the level of unemployed people that we expect to come out this year. Which is something about, you know, we expect like anywhere between 600 to 800,000 additional young unemployed people. But that's this year. That's not even saying what could happen if this thing runs on a bit longer.
Okay, so Annalise, tell us what you would do then, specifically around youth unemployment. And if you would, will you sort of touch on Future Jobs Fund, how you do something at scale, but then also teeing up Ewan, how you would do things that deals with, you know, university social mobility as well. So we try to tackle that as we think about this mass youth unemployment problem.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what's already been said. And I actually think that in order to deliver in these contexts, you know, it's very, very difficult to create a whole bunch of new institutions, and that just can't be done in the speed that is required here. From what I understand of the Future Jobs Fund, and obviously we looked quite carefully into how that worked previously, you know, the elements of it that perhaps didn't work quite so well, and those that did work, it did seem to have quite strong connections with different kind of intermediate actors, you know, so with local authorities, it had a kind of almost quality control approach, and you know, a board that made sure that it really was delivering additional opportunities, and there was business representation on that, as well as trade unions, all this kind of thing, quite locally rooted as well. So I think it's very, very important that if this scheme really is going to be additional, that it works with those institutions that are already there. Now that might mean that it takes a little bit longer for it to get going, but I think, you know, to me, the kind of almost nightmare scenario would be if we saw this being delivered in a very centralized way through, you know, maybe some major outsourcing companies. I mean, I'm sure that the latter would do the very best that they could, but if that just results in something kind of grafted on top of whatever schemes might already be there, and of course there are still a number of schemes for outreach to particularly impacted groups, you know, that existed before the crisis, but we need to get this ecology to work and not try and create something totally new. Let's go with the grain while we're trying to deal with this issue. However, in terms of the broader questions about education and social mobility, I mean, I think this is challenging. I mean, we were urging government to look at what could be done to encourage more young people to stay in education and training. But of course, you do still then get those issues about, you know, who is likely to do that. It's often those people who already had quite a high educational level, as we've already been talking about. Very important that routes like the apprenticeship one are made as attractive as possible, and that social mobility really is enabled through them. I mean, actually the most disadvantaged apprentices, we're going down in number for the lower qualification level apprenticeships. So let's kind of learn from what has worked both in the past and is working currently, and try and use that as speedily as we can to support those young people who are particularly impacted now.
All right, well, I'm going to come back to Ewan, because Ewan, I'd like to hear what you think. I know that the Chancellor made some proposals on apprenticeships, and I know there's some skepticism in the market about how impactful that will be. But if I offered you the same opportunity that I was offering Annalise, you know, with less likelihood of it happening, which is you get the chance to write that summer statement, what would you actually like to see the government doing to try and deal with this youth unemployment problem, as well as the social mobility problem that you've talked about?
I mean, I think that, by the way, part of the challenge with this is, and we do have to accept at a certain level, there's not an easy solution, right? There are a series of trade-offs that need to be made. And I think a lot of the challenge at the moment, though, is I'm not entirely sure the money's being spent in the right place, and where it does need to be spent, if enough of it is being spent. I think definitely, like, this is a two-way process. We need employers to be hiring at greater scale than they have been at the moment and over the last few months, if we're going to see the labour market pick up. So everything the government can do to incentivise employers to feel comfortable and secure hiring people is really important. And look, for example, one of the solutions that was mentioned earlier and was mooted a lot and talked about in some circles in government and elsewhere was the idea of having everyone spend 12 months doing some sort of training or voluntary work. I'm not sure that's the solution, because actually you need people to have real jobs, and you need them to have skills that the labour market needs. And actually, I remember this again from my time in welfare to work. Charities would often complain they were having people forced upon them who didn't really want to be there to go and do voluntary work that they then had to manage and try and cope with, and wasn't necessarily teaching them valuable skills. We've spent...
Ewan, can I just ask you a question about that? Because I'm the kind of sucker that promotes that kind of idea, right? So I just want to make sure that I'm totally right to realise that I'm wrong, right? Which is so. For example, I had this conversation. We were doing these CBI calls, and Ed Miliband was on and talking about the idea of, we're talking about FDR, and one of the things about the New Deal was also that it had a scene to it which was about big public works, but also the environment, right? And there was something called the Conservation Corps. 3 million young people were recruited in to obviously do some things that don't feel particularly environmental these days, like help build some highways, but also go out and plant trees. Now, to me, this seemed like a wonderful idea. Are you saying it's a really bad one?
I'm saying it alarms me if that's alighted on as the solution, because, you know, having lots of young people plant trees is not a bad thing in and of itself, but it's not going to give them long-term employment. It's definitely better than them doing nothing. I'd rather the government spend money on the thing that's really needed, which is a substantial wage subsidy for people at the very start of their careers, to, as I said, just encourage employers to unlock a lot of the hiring that exists. Oh, and we're seeing hiring start to come back on screen. I mean, we've got apprenticeship positions we're recruiting for at the moment at everyone from kind of Microsoft to Unilever to Charlotte Tilbury, Morgan Stanley. Lots of companies are beginning to do.
And sorry, Ewan, when you say a substantial subsidy, what's substantial?
It's got to be more than sort of £2,000 for an employer to take on an apprentice, because you need big employers in particular to engage with this. And it's a lot of the big employers in professional services and tech in particular, which is the area we focus on and will be a driver for so much economic growth over the coming years, and the jobs that young people really want to do as well.
And can you put a number, sorry, Ewan, to press you, but can you put a number on what that?
Yeah,
4,000, 3,000, 7,000.
Yeah, we talked about somewhere in the region of £5,000, looking at kind of what was available on universal credit and other things. I think anything less than that is challenging. And the problem with the Kickstarter scheme is actually, perversely, you can't do it if you're doing an apprenticeship, which doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not entirely sure why that is. And Kathleen raised a brilliant point, which is that it's been targeted at helping some young people in a very particular position who would have been struggling regardless, which is important to do, but it's not doing anything to help all of those young people and actually career changers and others who are at an unprecedented level of risk of losing their jobs or not being able to get a job. And by the way, the solution is definitely not for them all to go and spend an extra year in university.
Right. So £5,000, and your target age group is?
Oh, we typically place 16 to 23-year-olds who don't have university degrees.
But when you think about that wage subsidy, if you think about it as a policy idea, is that the target age group you would have in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the group we'd want to target any of these protections towards. I mean, the good news, by the way, is on reskilling. The apprenticeship levy is actually, and it's slightly crowded out opportunities for some young people, but we've seen employers reskilling existing members of their workforce through apprenticeships at a bigger level than they've been doing before.
Right. Well, I want to bring in a few people. I think, Mike Lloyd, you've had your hand up for a while. So, Mike, I'd like to hear from you and Mike, and then I'd love to come to Yasmin and then to Tessa. So, Mike first.
Great. Thank you, James. I'm wondering whether we should look at a voluntary 4-day week. So, by making it voluntary, it means there's no compulsion, so it doesn't impose hardship on anyone. And instead, people can feel good about signing up and helping others. I think there's a number of potentially desirable things coming from this. Certainly, it'll help with unemployment, inequality, and giving hope to the under 25s. It'll help with mental health, so fewer people in desperate circumstances. The people that are actually signing up to it will feel good about helping, and they'll also have the extra day a week, which can be beneficial. And it should help with government finances. The question, I guess, is it feasible? And my feeling on this is if there's a will, there's a way. But I do think that it probably would need the government to incentivize it to make sure that there aren't any barriers to people signing up, like, you know, the older people having any impact on their pensions. But, you know, the money that the government would save could also be targeted at, say, tax breaks or vouchers or reduced cost services like gym, leisure centre membership for lower cost. So you can actually sort of make a big difference to a lot of people by doing something that people sign up for. And the other thing that I think could come from this is, you can take the experience of the older workforce, and if they're giving up a day a week, they could use that extra day to train the younger workforce. So, I'm just putting it out there as I wonder what people think of that.
Mike, thank you. It's a really interesting subject. Fun enough, even before COVID, we actually had a think-in about a year ago on the future of the working week and this debate about a 4-day working week. Alice, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull together now a group of people who all I think are going to come at you with a rat-tat-tat of what about this, what about that, and then ask you to sort of pull together at the end. So Tessa Murray, my colleague here, had a sort of set of ideas, and I wanted to invite Tess to put them to you.
Hi, okay, so here's my shopping list. So first of all, I've got a bit of a concern about the regional variances of this with young people, particularly young people in rural economies. So, where transport and connectivity is a real issue, both in terms of the job market, but also access to education. So can we go for subsidised internet, subsidised travel, and continued support on a sectoral basis of hospitality, which is a really big thing for them. Anyone who knows me, I've got a real bee in my bonnet about the double taxation on childcare, anything that, the fact that childcare is paid out of net income, one simple thing, let's just deal with that and make it out of gross. And the other thing is, if we've got two issues, we've got to lower the pressure and the burden on the graduates and the young people who are coming into the jobs market whilst widening the funnel of jobs available. But while we're looking at the young people, should we just go for a targeted suspension of repayment on any loans? And as Ewan said, can we really up the ante on incentives for employers to use the apprentice scheme rather than just focus on the grad market?
So thank you very much, and also very succinct. And I'm going to ask Yasmin, Yasmin, if you're there, likewise, I'm going to ask you cruelly to make a point, but succinctly.
No worries. I think one of the challenges that I see is this disconnect between people's skill set and labor and the capital and how much they're valued in the society that we're in. And so I really struggle because so much of this conversation is how do we get people to be able to actually continue living, to be able to pay their basic needs, to be able to, when I think about the opportunities available for graduates, for people who are coming out of school, for people at all different levels, we still operate in a system where paths used to be you either get an apprenticeship or you go to university and then you'll have a job and you'll have an industry and you'll have a sector for the next 40 years, 50 years, and you'll be fine. That's just not the system. That's not the economy that we're living in. And yet there doesn't seem to be enough drive from any government to say, okay, what is the vision for what people are going to do with their lives? How will people be able to pay for 40, 50, 60 years worth of living if they're precarious, if they're in some sort of gig economy? And we've got kids coming in, you know, whether what White Hat is doing is fantastic, but it is an organization. It is not a government that is trying to look at an entire future. And I think that is a real challenge. It doesn't seem that there is any vision for what the rest of my life is supposed to look like.
All right. Yeah, Yasmin, thank you. Annalise, can you try to, it's a really unfair thing to try and do, but try to pull together at the end, say, all right, well, here, if you like, is the to-do list for government, not just, you know, for Labour, but for government in trying to tackle this problem.
Okay, I will try to, and I will try to do so while hopefully reflecting really, really quickly on what some of people have just said. I mean, first of all, I think it is to consider how we can have that salary support that will be necessary, without which people are simply not going to be able to stay in work, and without which we will see larger waves of people going into unemployment. I think around the point that made about the 4-day week, I mean, actually, of course, the challenge for a lot of people currently is that they're really worried because they can't amass enough hours. But, you know, what this whole crisis is showing is that we need to be able to have much better coordination, right, across our economy around these kinds of issues, particularly at times of crisis. You know, we had trade union involvement, business association, etc., involvement in creating the furlough scheme. They're needed now, actually, as we work out a way through this on a sectoral basis. That then links, I think, to points particularly about skills and what Yasmin was saying. I mean, we have been through a situation where a lot of work-based learning that was previously incentivized isn't so much there anymore. Big reductions in FE provision as well across the country. Obviously, that's had a knock-on impact on apprenticeships. That really needs to be dealt with. That was an issue for our productivity before this crisis started. It's clearly much, you know, even more urgent now. And then finally, we need to look at, you know, the rest of people's lives beyond the workplace and the challenges that they face. And some of the things that Tessa was talking about, you know, the preconditions for people just getting to work. You know, she mentioned a young person in a rural area. If we don't have those bus services there, for example, they're not going to be able to get where the jobs are. So we need to make sure that that infrastructure is around, also around childcare as well. We've weirdly moved into a more regressive system actually around some of this, with vouchers being removed and now the kind of tax rebate coming in, which benefits higher earners. You know, probably not very sensible. And again, look at what employers can be encouraged to do to really be supporting particularly young people. So hopefully I've provided a bit of an answer there and dealt with some of the points that people just mentioned, but probably not every single one. Sorry about that, but it's been a great conversation anyway.
Annalise, thank you. We are dealing with a huge problem in unemployment and quite a big one in me trying to keep things on time. As you can imagine, this is a conversation which could go on, but I see we've reached 7:30, and so the first thing I want to say was to thank everyone for their time and their contributions. Actually, Ewan and Kathleen and Annalise, you wouldn't have had the chance really to read as you were speaking, involved in the conversation. But one of the brilliant things about these kinds of discussions we found doing digitally is that people are contributing papers they've read, points of view, their personal experiences. So that also informs our journalism. We're going to look to do a big look at unemployment probably next week. That kind of tries to deal with some of the issues we've touched upon. Who's going to be affected? What are the meaningful approaches to responding to it? I suppose the thing that I just take away from this And like every good news meeting, you should come away at least a little bit clearer about what you think. And I suppose I come away thinking particularly two things. One is it's big and unfair, and we are underestimating how big, and we're underestimating how unfair. And there needs to be a much greater effort of communication, it seems to me, in the media, but also in the world of politics, on what's coming, because people are going to be shocked, and it's going to be really difficult, and no less difficult by not explaining it in advance. And then the second is this mix between sustaining jobs, Annalise, to your point, through extension of JRS, even on a targeted basis, you know, responsive to demand, but then also subsidy of jobs. And I'm really struck by the point that Kathleen was making about the Future Jobs Fund on scale, and the point that Ewan was making on actually really stepping up the support to employers to make it really, really attractive. And if you think about the mix, the Future Jobs Fund was cost of £6,000+ per person, right? Actually, what Ewan's talking about is an increase of £2,000 per employee. You suddenly see that you could do something at scale, and you could do it with existing organizations. So we'll begin to think about those things. Please do stick with us at Tortoise, in the sense that you can come and look and listen to this whole conversation on our website, but we'll also link you up to the work of the Resolution Foundation and what Ewan's doing at White Hat. But for now, thank you very much indeed. A big thank you to Ewan Blair, to Kathleen Henahan, and of course a huge thank you to you, the Shadow Chancellor, Annalise Dodds. Great talking to you. We can't thank you, we can just wave at you, so no applause, just waves. Thanks very much.